双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Betty Zane by Zane Grey. To the Betty Zane chapter of the Daughters of the Revolution, this book is respectfully dedicated by the author.
Note:
In a quiet corner of the stately little city of Wheeling, West Virginia, stands a monument on which is inscribed, by authority of the state of West Virginia to commemorate the siege of Fort Henry,
C'est 11,1782.
the last battle of the American Revolution. This tablet is here placed. Had it not been for the heroism of a girl, the foregoing inscription would never have been written, and the city of Wheeling would never have existed. From time to time, I have read short stories and magazine articles which have been published about Elizabeth Zane and her famous exploit, but they are unreliable in some particulars, which is owing, no doubt, to the singularly meager details available in histories of our western border. For 100 years the stories of Betty and Isaac Zane have been familiar, oft-repeated tales in my family, tales told with that pardonable ancestral pride which seems inherent in everyone. My grandmother loved to cluster the children round her and tell them that when she was a little girl she had knelt at the feet of Betty Zane, and listened to the old lady as she told of her brother's capture by the Indian princess, of the burning of the fort, and of her own race for life. I knew these stories by heart when a child. 2 years ago my mother came to me with an old notebook which had been discovered in some rubbish that had been placed in the yard to burn. The book had probably been hidden in an old picture frame for many years. It belonged to my great-grandfather, Colonel Ebenezer Zane. From its faded and time-worn pages, I have taken the main facts of my story. My regret is that a worthier pen than mine has not had this wealth of material. In this busy progressive age there are no heroes of the kind so dear to all lovers of chivalry and romance. There are heroes, perhaps, but they are the patient, sad-faced kind, of whom few take cognizance as they hurry onward. But cannot we all remember someone who suffered greatly, who accomplished great deeds, who died on the battlefield, someone around whose name lingers a halo of glory? Few of us are so unfortunate that we cannot look backward on kith or kin and thrill with love and reverence as we dream of an act of heroism or martyrdom which rings down the annals of time like the melody of the huntsman's horn, as it peals out on a frosty October morn, purer and sweeter with each succeeding note. If to any of those who have such remembrances, as well as those who have not, my story gives an hour of pleasure, I shall be rewarded.
Prologue.
On June 16, 1716, Alexander Spotswood, governor of the colony of Virginia, and a gallant soldier who had served under Marlborough in the English wars,
rode
at the head of a dauntless band of cavaliers, down the quiet street of quaint old Williamsburg. The adventurous spirits of this party of men urged them toward the land of the setting sun, that unknown west far beyond the blue-crested mountains rising so grandly before them. Months afterward they stood on the western range of the great North Mountains towering above the picturesque Shenandoah Valley, and from the summit of one of the loftiest peaks, where, until then, the foot of a white man had never trod, they viewed the vast expanse of plain and forest with glistening eyes. Returning to Williamsburg, they told of the wonderful richness of the newly discovered country, and thus opened the way for the venturesome pioneer who is destined to overcome all difficulties and make a home in the Western world. But 50 years and more passed before a white man penetrated far beyond the purple spires of those majestic mountains. One bright morning in June, 1769, the figure of a stalwart, broad-shouldered man could have been seen standing on the wild and rugged promontory which rears its rocky bluff high above the Ohio River, at a point near the mouth of Wheeling Creek. He was alone save for the companionship of a deerhound that crouched at his feet. As he leaned on a long rifle, contemplating the glorious scene that stretched before him, a smile flashed across his bronzed cheek, and his heart bounded as he forecast the future of that spot. In the river below him lay an island so round and green that it resembled a huge lily pad floating placidly on the water. The fresh green foliage of the trees sparkled with glittering dewdrops. Back of him rose the high ridges, and, In front, as far as I could reach, extended an unbroken forest. Beneath him to the left and across a deep ravine, he saw a wide, level clearing. The few scattered and blackened tree stumps showed the ravages made by a forest fire in the years gone by. The field was now overgrown with hazel and laurel bushes, and intermingling with them the trailing arbutus, the honeysuckle, and the wild rose. A fragrant perfume was wafted upward to him. A rushing creek bordered one edge of the clearing. After a long, quiet reach of water, which could be seen winding back in the hills, the stream tumbled madly over a rocky ledge, and, white with foam, it hurried onward as if impatient of long restraint, and lost its individuality in the broad Ohio. This solitary hunter was Colonel Ebenezer Zane. He was one of those daring men who, as the tide of emigration started westward, had left his friends and family and had struck out alone into the wilderness. Departing from his home in eastern Virginia, he had plunged into the woods, and after many days of hunting and exploring, he reached the then far western Ohio Valley. The scene so impressed Colonel Zane that he concluded to found a settlement there, taking tomahawk possession of the locality, which consisted of blazing a few trees with his tomahawk. He built himself a rude shack and remained that summer on the Ohio. In the autumn he set out for Berkeley County, Virginia, to tell his people of the magnificent country he had discovered. The following spring he persuaded a number of settlers, of a like spirit with himself, to accompany him to the wilderness. Believing it unsafe to take their families with them at once, they left them at Redstone on the Monongahela River, while the men, including Colonel Zane, his brothers Silas, Andrew, Jonathan, and Isaac, the Wetzels, McCullochs, Bennetts, Metzars, and others, pushed on ahead. The country through which they passed was one tangled, most impenetrable forest. The axe of the pioneer had never sounded in this region, where every rod of the way might harbor some unknown danger. These reckless bordermen knew not the meaning of fear. To all, daring adventure was welcome, and the screech of a redskin and the ping of a bullet were familiar sounds. To the Wetzels, McCullochs, and Jonathan Zane, the hunting of Indians was the most thrilling passion of their lives. Indeed, the Wetzels, particularly, knew no other occupation. They had attained a wonderful skill with the rifle. Long practice had rendered their senses as acute as those of the fox, skilled in every variety of woodcraft, with lynx eyes ever on the alert for detecting a trail, or the curling smoke of some campfire, or the minutest sign of an enemy. These men stole onward through the forest with a cautious but dogged and persistent determination that was characteristic of the settler. They at length climbed the commanding bluff overlooking the majestic river, and as they gazed out on the undulating and uninterrupted area of green, their hearts beat high with hope. The keen axe, wielded by strong arms, soon opened the clearing and reared stout log cabins on the river bluff. Then Ebenezer Zane and his followers moved their families, and soon the settlement began to grow and flourish. As the little village commenced to prosper, the redmen became troublesome. Settlers were shot while plowing the fields or gathering the harvests. Bands of hostile Indians prowled around and made it dangerous for anyone to leave the clearing. Frequently, the first person to appear in the early morning would be shot at by an Indian concealed in the woods. General George Rogers Clark, commandant of the Western Military Department, arrived at the village in 1774. As an attack from the savages was apprehended during the year, the settlers determined to erect a fort as a defense for the infant settlement. It was planned by General Clark and built by the people themselves. At first they called it Fort Fincastle, in honor of Lord Dunmore, who, at the time of its erection, was governor of the colony of Virginia. In 1776, its name was changed to Fort Henry, in honor of Patrick Henry. For many years it remained the most famous fort on the frontier, having withstood numberless Indian attacks and two memorable sieges, one in 1777, which year is called the Year of the Bloody Sevens, and again in 1782. In this last siege, the British Rangers under Hamilton took part with the Indians, making the attack practically the last battle of the Revolution. Betty Zane. Chapter 1. The Zane family was a remarkable one in early days, and most of its members are historical characters. The first Zane of whom any trace can be found was a Dane of aristocratic lineage, who was exiled from his country and came to America with William Penn. He was prominent for several years in the new settlement founded by Penn, and Zane Street, Philadelphia, bears his name. Being a proud and arrogant man, he soon became obnoxious to his Quaker brethren. He therefore cut loose from them and emigrated to Virginia, settling on the Potomac River, in what was then known as Berkeley County. There his 5 sons and 1 daughter, the heroine of the story, were born. Ebenezer Zane, the eldest, was born October 7, 1747, and grew to manhood in the Potomac Valley. There he married Elizabeth McCulloch, a sister of the famous McCulloch brothers, so well known in frontier history. Ebenezer was fortunate in having such a wife, and no pioneer could have been better blessed. She was not only a handsome woman, but one of remarkable force of character as well as kindness of heart. She was particularly noted for a rare skill in the treatment of illness, and her deftness in handling the surgeon's knife and extracting a poisoned bullet or arrow from a wound had restored to health many a settler when all had despaired. The Zane brothers were best known on the border for their athletic prowess and for their knowledge of Indian warfare and cunning. They were all powerful men, exceedingly active and as fleet as deer. In appearance they were singularly pleasing and bore a marked resemblance to one another, all having smooth faces, clear-cut, regular features, dark eyes, and long black hair. When they were as yet boys they had been captured by Indians soon after their arrival on the Virginia border, and had been taken far into the interior and held as captives for 2 years. Ebenezer, Silas, and Jonathan Zane were then taken to Detroit and ransomed. While attempting to swim the Scioto River in an effort to escape, Andrew Zane had been shot and killed by his pursuers. But the bonds that held Isaac Zane, the remaining and youngest brother, were stronger than those of interest or revenge, such as had caused the captivity of his brothers. He was loved by an Indian princess, the daughter of Tarhi, the chief of the puissant Huron race. Isaac had escaped on various occasions, but had always been retaken, and at the time of the opening of our story, nothing had been heard of him for several years, and it was believed he had been killed. At the period of the settling of the little colony in the wilderness, Elizabeth Zane, the only sister, was living with an aunt in Philadelphia, where she was being educated. Colonel Zane's house, a 2-story structure built of rough-hewn logs, was the most comfortable one in the settlement, and occupied a prominent site on the hillside about 100 yards from the fort. It was constructed of heavy timber and presented rather a forbidding appearance with its square corners, its ominous-looking portholes, and strongly barred doors and windows. There were 3 rooms on the ground floor, a kitchen, a magazine room for military supplies, and a large room for general use. The several sleeping rooms were on the 2nd floor, which was reached by a steep stairway. The interior of a pioneer's rude dwelling did not reveal, as a rule, more than bare walls, a bed or 2, a table and a few chairs, in fact, no more than the necessities of life. But Colonel Zane's house proved an exception to this. Most interesting was the large room. The chinks between the logs had been plastered up with clay, and then the walls covered with white birch bark. Trophies of the chase, Indian bows and arrows, pipes and tomahawks hung upon them. The wide spreading antlers of a noble buck adorned the space above the mantelpiece. Buffalo robes covered the couches. Bearskin rugs lay scattered about on the hardwood floor. The wall on the western side had been built over a huge stone, into which had been cut an open fireplace. This blackened recess, which had seen 2 houses burned over it, when full of blazing logs, had cheered many noted men with its warmth. Lord Dunmore, General Clark, Simon Kenton, And Daniel Boone had sat beside that fire. Their corn planter, the Seneca chief, had made his famous deal with Colonel Zane, trading the island in the river opposite the settlement for a barrel of whiskey. Logan, the Mingo chief and friend of the whites, had smoked many pipes of peace there with Colonel Zane. At a later period, when King Louis Philippe, who had been exiled from France by Napoleon, had come to America, during the course of his melancholy wanderings he had stopped at Fort Henry a few days. His stay there was marked by a fierce blizzard, and the royal guest passed most of his time at Colonel Zane's fireside. Musing by those roaring logs, perhaps he saw the radiant star of the man of destiny rise to its magnificent zenith. One cold, raw night in early spring, the colonel had just returned from one of his hunting trips, and the tramping of horses mingled with the rough voices of the Negro slaves sounded without. When Colonel Zane entered the house, he was greeted affectionately by his wife and sister. The latter, at the death of her aunt in Philadelphia, had come west to live with her brother, and had been there since late in the preceding autumn. It was a welcome sight for the eyes of a tired and weary hunter. The tender kiss of his comely wife, the cries of the delighted children, and the crackling of the fire warmed his heart and made him feel how good it was to be home again after a 3 days' march in the woods. Placing his rifle in a corner and throwing aside his wet hunting coat, he turned and stood with his back to the bright blaze. Still young and vigorous, Colonel Zane was a handsome man.
Tall,
though not heavy, his frame denoted great strength and endurance. His face was smooth, his heavy eyebrows met in a straight line. His eyes were dark and now beamed with a kindly light. His jaw was square and massive, his mouth resolute. In fact, his whole face was strikingly expressive of courage and geniality. A great wolf dog had followed him in and, tired from travel, had stretched himself out before the fireplace, laying his noble head on the paws he had extended toward the warm blaze.
Well,
I am nearly starved and mighty glad to get back, said the colonel, with a smile of satisfaction at the steaming dishes a Negro servant was bringing from the kitchen. We are glad you have returned, answered his wife, whose glowing face testified to the pleasure she felt. Supper is ready, Annie. Bring in some cream, yes. Indeed, I am happy that you are home. I never have a moment's peace when you are away, especially when you are accompanied by Louis Wetzel. Our hunt was a failure, said the colonel, after he had helped himself to a plate full of roast wild turkey. The bears have just come out of their winter's sleep and are unusually wary at this time. We saw many signs of their work, tearing rotten logs to pieces in search of grubs and bees' nests. Wetzel killed a deer, and we baited a likely place where we had discovered many bear tracks. We stayed up all night in a drizzling rain, hoping to get a shot. I am tired out. So is Tige. Wetzel did not mind the weather or the ill luck, and when we ran across some Indian sign, he went off on one of his lonely tramps, leaving me to come home alone. He is such a reckless man, remarked Mrs. Zane. Wetzel is reckless, or rather, daring. His incomparable nerve carries him safely through many dangers, where an ordinary man would have no show whatever.
well,
Betty, how are you? Quite well, said the slender, dark-eyed girl who had just taken the seat opposite the colonel. Bessie, has my sister indulged in any shocking escapade in my absence? I think that last trick of hers, when she gave a bucket of hard cider to that poor tame bear, should last her a spell.
no,
For a wonder, Elizabeth has been very good. However, I do not attribute it to any unusual change of temperament. Simply the cold, wet weather. I anticipate a catastrophe very shortly if she is kept indoors much longer. I have not had much opportunity to be anything but well behaved. If it rains a few days more, I shall become desperate. I want to ride my pony, roam the woods, paddle my canoe, and enjoy myself, said Elizabeth.
well,
Bets, I knew it would be dull here for you, but you must not get discouraged. You know you got here late last fall, and have not had any pleasant weather yet. It is perfectly delightful in May and June. I can take you to fields of wild white honeysuckle and mayflowers and wild roses. I know you love the woods, so be patient a little longer. Elizabeth had been spoiled by her brothers. What girl would not have been by 5 great big worshippers? And any trivial thing gone wrong with her was a serious matter to them. They were proud of her, and of her beauty and accomplishments, were never tired of talking. She had the dark hair and eyes so characteristic of the Zanes, the same oval face and fine features. And added to this was a certain softness of contour and a sweetness of expression which made her face bewitching.
But,
in spite of that demure and innocent face, she possessed a decided will of her own, and one very apt to be asserted. She was mischievous, inclined to coquettishness, and more terrible than all, she had a fiery temper which could be aroused with the most surprising ease. Colonel Zane was wont to say that his sister's accomplishments were innumerable. After only a few months on the border, she could prepare the flax and weave a linsey dress cloth with admirable skill. Sometimes, to humor Betty, the colonel's wife would allow her to get the dinner, and she would do it in a manner that pleased her brothers, and called forth golden praises from the cook, old Sam's wife, who had been with the family 20 years. Betty sang in the little church on Sundays. She organized and taught a Sunday school class. She often beat Colonel Zane and Major McCulloch at their favorite game of checkers, which they had played together since they were knee-high. In fact, Betty did nearly everything well, from baking pies to painting the birch bark walls of her room. But these things were insignificant in Colonel Zane's eyes. If the colonel were ever guilty of bragging, it was about his sister's ability in those acquirements demanding a true eye, a fleet foot, a strong arm, and a daring spirit. He had told all the people in the settlement, to many of whom Betty was unknown, that she could ride like an Indian and shoot with undoubted skill, that she had a generous share of the Zanes' fleetness of foot, and that she would send a canoe over as bad a place as she could find. The boasts of the colonel remained as yet unproven. But, be that as it may, Betty had, notwithstanding her many faults, endeared herself to all. She made sunshine and happiness everywhere. The old people loved her, the children adored her, and the broad-shouldered, heavy-footed young settlers were shy and silent, yet blissfully happy in her presence. "Betty, will you fill my pipe?" asked the colonel, when he had finished his supper and had pulled his big chair nearer the fire. His oldest child,
Noah,
a sturdy lad of 6, climbed upon his knee and plied him with questions. "Did you see any bars and bufflers?" he asked, his eyes large and round.
"No,
"My lad, not one." "How long will it be until I am big enough to go?" "Not for a very long time, Noah. But I am not afraid of Betty's bar. He growls at me when I throw sticks at him, and snaps his teeth." "Can I go with you next time?" "My brother came over from Short Creek today. He has been to Fort Pitt," interposed Mrs. Zane. As she was speaking, a tap sounded on the door, which, being opened by Betty, disclosed Captain Boggs, his daughter Lydia, and Major Samuel McCulloch, the brother of Mrs. Zane.
Ah,
"Colonel, I expected to find you at home tonight. The weather has been miserable for hunting, and it is not getting any better. The wind is blowing from the northwest, and a storm is coming," said Captain Boggs, a fine, soldierly-looking man. "Hello, Captain. How are you, Sam? I have not had the pleasure of seeing you for a long time,"
replied Colonel Zane.
as he shook hands with his guests. Major McCulloch was the eldest of the brothers of that name. As an Indian killer, he ranked next to the intrepid Wetzel. But while Wetzel preferred to take his chances alone and track the Indians through the untrodden wilds, McCulloch was a leader of expeditions against the savages. A giant in stature, massive in build, bronzed and bearded, he looked the typical frontiersman. His blue eyes were like those of his sister, and his voice had the same pleasant ring. "Major McCulloch, do you remember me?" asked Betty. "Indeed I do," he answered, with a smile. "You were a little girl, running wild, on the Potomac when I last saw you. Do you remember when you used to lift me on your horse and give me lessons in riding?